Yo, what is up everybody? Daybreak preview season has ended, so we're going to take a look at all of the cards in Daybreak. We're going to start off this video with Lunar, Earth, and Fire and take a look at what new cards they brought to the table, what interesting things you can get up to basically in this set. And as always, hey, like and subscribe, and if you want to check out Daybreak, I do have a referral link down below. Check that out too. Let's jump in to the set. Starting with Lunar. There's not a ton of Lunar in the set, but we'll start with one of the two main Lunar Elestrals is Pendulance. So it's a 4/1 for 1 Lunar. You can disenchant 1 Lunar from this Pendulance in order to return a counter rune from your underworld to your rune row face down. So at a 4/1 body, it's a lot better than Panda Sin's stat body. It's nice to have the offensive body, especially if you compare it with like Zeus or Demeter, depending on what deck you're playing. 4/1 is a nice attack stat. It gets over a decent chunk of things. Disenchanting a Lunar from Pendulance to turn a counter rune to your underworld to your rune face down is really powerful. Imagine using a shield over and over again, re-enchanting Pendulance, getting shield back, recasting shield. That could be pretty devastating if your opponent can't find rune removal or Elestral removal that doesn't involve attacking. However, it is pretty expensive and does require you to have a board state to continually use it effectively while only dealing 1 damage a turn with Pendulance if you attack with it and constantly spending 2 to use shield to pay for it. So it's probably going to be alright. If we get better Lunar Nexus cards or any Lunar Nexus cards in the future, Pendulance might get better, but I think right now it's pretty bad, but it has a chance of kind of really breaking in a control Lunar deck if we get that in the future, of just recycling your counter runes over and over and over again. We're getting PTAs and shields and Gorgons, etc. And then pairing that with recovery engine cards, which could be pretty powerful, but we'll have to see. I think right now though it's pretty bad and probably won't see any play, especially since there's not a lot of Lunar in play. Next up, Spectus. Spectus is a 4/2 for 1 Lunar. This Spectus gets 1 attack for each suppressed Celestial in the field. When the Spectus enters battle with an Celestial, you can suppress the Celestial until the end phase. So this is kind of a pseudo 5 attacker. Bear in note, when it enters battle, it doesn't need to declare the attack itself, so it's kind of combat immune from like Volcaris, Tectorus, Neblio is one of the new cards that it kind of outs. It destroys foamies. This card's pretty powerful. Its attack stat is fine. The fact that it basically becomes a 5 attacker when you use it is pretty strong, and it has kind of the potential of Viserys to get a little bit stronger depending on other cards in play. This card's going to be pretty strong. I think again, kind of with Pendulance, is there's not a lot of Lunar cards to play with it. So while it's a good card, it might not see a ton of play yet in the main deck just because there's no more support for Lunar except for this and Dense Fog and the Camels. So I think it might just be missing some pieces still. But I could see it being a side option against maybe like water floating stuff, like anyone who's playing foamies and stuff like that. It might be pretty good against, but as of right now, it's okay. I definitely think this is going to be a monster once we actually have proper Lunar decks floating around that this could be played in. Alright, next up we'll talk about Faramel. Faramel is a 4/7 for 1 Solar, 1 Lunar, so I'm going to count this as a Lunar card since its Ascension is Lunar. When your opponent declares an attack, you can expend Lunar in order to negate the attack and special send this Faramel to Faraggeist from your hand or deck. So it's kind of a shield on a body that doesn't bounce, but it lets you get into its Ascension form, which can't be destroyed by battle. This card's pretty dirty just because it forces your opponent to have a removal outside of combat, which if you're a good deck you should have, and if you're playing against Camels you're going to know that they're playing this, so you should be prepared for it. However, there's ways to make this pretty frustrating to deal with, where if you put like a bag of wins on this, now your opponent needs multiple cards to out it, and it just sits there as a wall that you can't actually attack over for a while, which is a frustrating card for sure. And you basically never attack this unless you're trying to burn your opponent out, because they're just going to get their bigger, even more difficult to out Camel. So I think this card's fine. It's a pretty good bridge because as a bridge, it does exactly what its bridging into does. So it does the same thing as Faraggeist, just a little bit weaker. So basically forces your opponent to never be able to attack you, or else you just get Faraggeist out. Or maybe you've tried to find a way to attack into this to bait it, or you attack with the Vertaqua. So there's reasonable ways to out it, but I think that, again, kind of with the whole Lunar shtick right now, is there's not a ton of Lunar support to make it work. So if it's going to be workable, you got to make it in a Solar deck. And Faraggeist doesn't like to be in a Solar deck. So if you can make a Solar control deck and put a 1 of Faraggeist with some Lunar in there, maybe this works out fine. I think this card's annoying, not great, but it's an awesome bridge thematically for Faraggeist. So let's talk about Faraggeist. It's a 2 Lunar, 9/13, 1 Solar. This Faraggeist can be destroyed in battle, this Faraggeist cannot be destroyed in battle, and it cannot be returned to the hand by opponent's card effects. So you can't shield this, and you can't attack into it for damage, and you can't destroy it. Opponents must also expend 1 in order to cast cards, so any card you're playing gets taxed by 1 more. This is really powerful. However, it is outed by things like Earthquake, like a Boom Bat. Like, there's tons of ways to out this card efficiently enough where if you Earthquake this card, yeah, it costs 3 to cast that Earthquake, but you still get rid of this pretty easily. So it's got still the 3-drop issue of, hey, you can just destroy it. It is really nice that if it hits play, it basically will connect because it can't be bounced by shield. Your opponent doesn't really want to Gorgons this. Your opponent doesn't really want to PTA this too much because it's really costly, but they might have to. So I think it's pretty good. Just if you're playing a deck built around this, your opponent knows it. They're going to have tons of side removal options for this card that make this card bad. But in a game 1 scenario where your opponent might not have those options, this card's pretty good. So in a best of 1 or in a game 1, this card's pretty nasty. If there's a way that you can switch it out for something else, so your opponent brings in dead cards, or you just protect it with Bag of Winds and Golden Fleeces, that could get pretty powerful as well, but I don't think it's going to see a ton of play just yet because, again, there's not a ton of Lunar support, so it's hard to ascend into without its bridge, and the bridge doesn't ever really ascend because your opponent doesn't have to attack to allow you to ascend into the bridge. So Fairgeist is alright, but it could get better in the future. And lastly, I'll talk about Dense Fog in the Lunar Clump. So Dense Fog is a 1-cost counter rune that suppresses each Elestral that is not Lunar enchanted until the end phase. Obviously, this is kind of a call to Tsunami, where Tsunami is really powerful, except water decks. It's going to be powerful against every deck in the format right now because there's not enough Lunar to see play. So this is honestly looking to be kind of an auto-include 3 of in most decks, which is going to be frustrating because there's no Lunar to check it. And if you're trying to check it by not suppressing something by putting a Lunar on something, then it's probably misenchanted and suppressed anyway. So this card is going to be really frustrating to deal with for players. I especially think until we get more Lunar cards in the next set because, again, there's no checks for this card except playing Lunar Spirits that you probably don't need. The only decks that really are probably going to be playing Lunar Spirits innately are going to be things like Kerbis for Rock and a Hard Place. So in that situation, you might be able to put a Lunar on something, but generally this Dense Fog is going to be really frustrating to deal with. Now, unlike Gorgons, is you can't use this reactively, you have to use it preemptively, so you have to use it before your opponent declares an effect. And if the first thing your opponent does in their turn is activate an effect, this card won't work. So it does need to be set first. So there are some drawbacks to this as opposed to Gorgons, but I think until we get more Lunar cards, this card's going to be kind of frustrating, kind of how Tsunami was in early base set testing and playing, because not a ton of people played Water. Tsunami was just an auto-include in every deck because you never played against Water. This is going to be auto-include in every deck because you're never playing against Lunar, and it's going to shut off a ton of card effects. And if your opponent, say, uses a Nexus Celestial, you can let the Nexus basically look, oh, in response to Nexus, I Dense Fog, so they get to Nexus, but they don't get the other effect and stuff like that. It's just, there's a lot going on with this card. I think it's really powerful. It's just, you got to use it before an effect activates, which isn't too much to ask because if your opponent has like Celestial in play, Response Window, Dense Fog it, you're going to want to Dense Fog it no matter what. So yeah, it's going to be a menace. It's going to be really powerful, but I don't hate it. I just think we need more Lunar to make sure it's a little bit more checked than it is right now. Right now it's probably going to be auto-include in every deck. Moving on to Earth now, we have Mudlet, a 3/3 for 1 Earth. When this Mudlet receives 1 or more Earth, you can change position of Elestral. So it's kind of like Sorlet on a cast, as well as the ability to receive to trigger position change effects. We've seen position swap effects be pretty powerful. Now, the deck that this goes into probably doesn't necessarily exist right now. Like maybe you put this in Earth Beaters, but you have to switch up Earth Beaters a little bit because you probably want to put some altars in there to make better use of this card. So it kind of makes a little bit more of a defensive Earth deck or a little bit more of a controlling Earth deck where you're allowed to kind of use this to position swap things. Maybe you get this with a Viserys in play, Viserys attacks, and use Altar to swap your other Viserys. Like, it makes a lot of really interesting plays. There's Bloom now, which we'll get into in a little bit, that allows you to trigger this twice in a turn. So this is going to be a really powerful card, I would think. Just because we see position swap effects pretty commonly used, and 3 attack does mean that since most things have like 2 defense or 2 attack, vice versa if they're aggressive or defensive bodies, this does get over a lot of walls and it gets over a lot of attackers by switching their position. I could definitely see this being a 3 of a deck, and maybe Earth Nexus as a deck becomes more viable, which a lot of people have tried with Frostfall with Panzer and Equal Links and like Splashington Tarbor, this might make an Earth Nexus deck have more viability outside of just trying to get into a Centaur and do some janky stuff there. I think it'd be a really good card, especially with Equal Links. Like Position Swap and popping a back row means you could generally trade into front end bodies pretty easily. Moving on, Kbor, 7/5 for 2 Earth. You can expend 2 Earth in order to target an opponent's Elestrals, suppress the Elestral, and destroy it. It's Earthquake with suppression on legs. Is that good enough? I think this is going to be a card where you maybe run 1 or 2 of in your deck just because you can. Like, if you get it out, it's going to be pretty strong. Earth doesn't have a ton of good ways to ascend into a 2-drop consistently, where the only really ascensions in Earth that are played are like Lodagon and Fruit, because you can take effect of that and repeatedly abuse it pretty quickly. Otherwise, Earth 2-drops don't see play, except even maybe Fringe Vertilith doesn't really see play. So there's a reason for that. The Earth 1-drops are pretty useful and do enough on their own that I don't think this is going to be enough to warrant an auto-include into a deck. But I can see why someone would run 1 or 2 of these in their deck, maybe 3 of in a Weird Wild World. It does still get responded to by counter runes and stuff, so that does leave it a little bit fragile in a sense. But it's a pretty cool card, and I think it's definitely a late game coming down. It could be pretty impactful. I just don't see why you would run this over just making sure you have the Earthquakes and maybe a couple of Royals to remove things, and then using your little other aggressive bodies to do everything else. But we'll have to see how people like the card. I think it's fine. It's fine. It's not amazing. Boltuga, a 3/4 for 1 Earth. When you normally cast Boltuga, you can expend Earth in order to search your deck or Underworld for an eruption and add it to your hand. So this is basically a 3-cost eruption. So this is eruption 4, 5, 6 in your deck. It's going to be pretty powerful just because eruption is a powerful card. Now your opponent, yes, can see the writing on the wall if you're playing Earth Fire that you're running eruptions. And we have seen some Earth Fire decks do a little well in the casual events for Frostfall. Shout out to Bean Soldier and his Pandison burn deck that he played. So this card's going to be really powerful. No matter what deck you're playing, if you're playing a burn deck, you're playing this card. There's lots of more burn cards to add into the format, so this just lets you go find eruption in your deck. And even if you only run 1 eruption and 3 Boltuga, you can just, every time you play Boltuga, grab eruption back from your Underworld. It's fine. It does make this a 3-cost eruption with a 3/4 body, which that's honestly not bad. Like, if you look at this card as 4 cost, put a 3/4 or 1 cost 3/4 body in play and burn your opponent for 3, would you play that? Maybe. Now, if you could do it on repeat, probably. So I think this card's gonna be pretty powerful, especially with its Ascension. I think its Ascension combos really well with the deck archetype it's trying to play. So let's jump into the Ascension now, and that's gonna be Vesatuga, a 5/8 for 1 Earth, 1 Fire. When you can expend 1 Fire to burn your opponent for 2. When a player casts Eruption, you can turn 2 Earth from your Underworld to your Spirit deck. So this is very similar to, obviously, Krakatuga. It's Vesatuga. The fact that it's a 1 cost for 2 burn makes this a way better rate than 2 cost for 3 burn. However, it doesn't have as much kind of burn potential with Krakatuga and Eruption does. So in this case, you cast Eruption and you can return Earth. So it heals with Eruption, and it specifically heals Earth. So you're going to want to have Earth Spirits in your Underworld before you cast Eruption to get use out of the effect. But the fact that this is 1 cost burn for 2, that is repeatable every turn, is going to make all the difference with this card. I think it's going to be pretty powerful, especially if you throw like a Bag of Winds or a Fleece on it to make it protected, so your opponent has to spend lots of resources to remove it, burning themselves as well, or they have to basically just try to out it some other way while you just burn for 2 every turn with it. Maybe throw some eruptions at the end to recover some spirits. This card's pretty powerful. I don't know if I like it more than Krakatuga, but the fact that we now have some Earthburn cards probably makes this pretty relevant. So I can definitely see this being used a lot more than Krakatuga, but we'll have to wait and see if people like Water Fire over Earth Water or vice versa for other burn decks. I think most people might just play like Thunder Wind Earth, Splash Fire for Boltuga, but we'll see. We'll see. Next up, we have Barab, a 1/1 for 1 Earth. You can cast Invoke Rune with Earth. Your opponent must expend 1. This effect can be activated up to 4 times in a turn. When you cast Mudslide, you can special send Barab to Barabog from your hand or deck. The special ascension I don't think is relevant at all for this card, because cool, you get Barab out. Now there's a world where you play 4 Invoke runes, like you go Nectar, Ambrosia, Cornucopia, Nectar or something. Burn your opponent for 4, get a bunch of card advantage, and then special cast a Barab and go defense and sit on that so that your opponent has to burn even more things on their turn. But I think the real menace of this card is going to be in that Fruit Engine deck where you just kind of put in Drops of Leaf, Nogs, Ambrosias, Dratayas, Rise from the Ashes. You play Barab, Drops of Leaf, into Nog, into Ambrosia, recover some spirits, burn your opponent for 4, play a bunch of back row, pass turn. Your opponent maybe outs Barab, then you go Rise from the Ashes, play another Barab, and now you burn for 8 by doing another draw chain. I think that's where this card's going to be really nasty. Is this card crazy? Maybe not, but I can definitely see this card being a pretty hefty threat in a fruit deck, even as a 1 or 2 of when you get to that draw engine potential where you just go Drataya, a bunch of Ambrosias, and Barab in play. It's going to be really nasty. But it is a 1-1, it does dice to everything, and the Mudslide part is null and void, but the fact that you can only burn up to 4 is also a little weak sometimes, and you might not be able to continuously chain combos, so I don't want to get people too afraid about that, but if this card is very powerful, it's going to be in just a chain draw invoke deck, where this is the win condition. Otherwise, it's not playable. If you're not abusing this card, you're not winning with this card. So if you can abuse it in a chain draw kind of combo deck, then this is a burn card that will win you the game. Barab reprint, cool. Next up, we're going to talk about Mudslide, relevant with Barab, just Barab talking about. It's a 2-cost Earth, Water, Invoke rune. An opponent must disenchant 1 from each of their runes. You may enchant 1 Earth or Water to your field. This card is interesting. So I definitely think artifact decks might be pretty powerful in the next set. And this is a way to deal with artifact decks without targeting them to get around like things like Guardian. It's also a way to kind of deal with stadiums, deal with maybe a low enchanted like Aeolus or Zeus on board. So this is going to be a pretty decent card in the side deck. I would think this is a side deck all-star against rune-heavy decks like Thunder Nexus. Any Nexus deck that likes to load up spirits onto their runes. They have a Zeus in play, they have a Mental Olympus in play, etc. It's going to be pretty nice to just kind of drop a Mudslide. You're not targeting anything, so they can't use things like Guardian of the Fleece, and just make them disenchant so they're under-enchanted, blow things up, especially artifact decks and the like. But it's not strong enough, I think, to see play in your main deck unless you're literally playing Barab, which I don't think you are. And the enchant Earth or Water to your field is nice, especially if you're playing a control deck with Mudlets or Drataguas, where you can heal or position manipulate, or maybe Clovey to draw a card. It's nice to be able to trigger those receivers with this card as well, or load up spirits for your own Nexus strategies on your turn after you blow up your opponent's stuff. So I think this card's going to be pretty good in a side deck situation. I don't see it being mained at all just because it's a little too niche to main deck, even though it does have some pretty powerful connotations against like artifact decks and stuff like that in going into Daybreak. And lastly for Earth, we have Bloom, a 1-cost counter rune that says you can Nexus 1 Earth. If you do, you can enchant Earth to an Elestral on your field. This is going to be pretty good. We saw Mudlet as a good receiver, and Clovey is a decent receiver for this card. So along with like Foliage Forest and Demeters, you can really kind of frustratingly manipulate your board state so your opponent can't deal with your things. This with Mudlet is basically Tsunami on a stick, as well as it's a way to get lots of spirits onto a Mudlet to then maybe go into Centaur. Like, is Centaur maybe viable with this card with the Demeter deck now? Possibly. Additionally, you can load up spirits, extra spirits onto like a Panzer that you just played, so you can Nexus the Panzer and then Nexus off Panzer to re-enchant Panzer, recover the one spirit you just got from Bloom, as well as trigger maybe a Clovey on the side as well. This can make a pretty good defensive Earth Nexus draw deck, I would think, with Foliage Forest, as well as also maybe give you the ability to Nexus stuff to pump up a big attack threat in Earth as well. I think the card's really powerful. We need more ways to quote-unquote abuse it for it to be really powerful, but it's got the makings of another really powerful counter rune that Nexus, like Nexus Enchant, it basically triggers whatever Earth receive you have twice, so if you get more good Earth receivers, this is going to go pretty hard. So we'll see what comes out, but I think right now it's fine, as well as, you know, you might be able to do some shenanigans with Mudlet. And last but not least, we're going to go into Fire for the set. We have Fun Guide, a 1/1 for 1 fire. Your Elestrals cannot be attacked except for this Fun Guide. When a player casts Follow the Wisp, you can special cast a Bronto Wisp from your hand or deck. Let's start with the you can't attack except Fungi. So if you have 2 Fungi on play, your opponent can't attack at all because both of them say you can't attack unless you attack this Fungi. Meaning that you just can't attack because you can't attack this one, because you have to attack this one, you can't attack this one, you have to attack this one. Now the odds of you getting 2 Fungi to play consistently are pretty negligible. Even with Bronto Whis, I think it's going to be pretty much a tall task to ask for, especially with the removal options and stuff that players will have access to. But it does ask your opponent to answer it if you do get to it, and it's a pretty powerful attack lock, so I think it's going to be a card that's not really meta playable, but it's going to be definitely like maybe tier 2 or 3 if you control fire deck pops off, and it will be frustrating to deal with for a lot of players, especially new players. If a new player goes into 2 Fungi, they're not going to know what to do, so I think this is probably a little bit of a noob trap card, but it does look like it's going to be interesting, especially if there's better ways to get 2 of them out, like your Bronto Whis, which is a 6/5 for 1 fire, to Lunar. You can disenchant fire from your Fungi in order to target and destroy a room. When Elestral in your field is destroyed in battle, you can spend fire in order to special cast a Fungi from your underworld. It is a little clunky to get out, unlike Bronto Glow with Thunderstorm, and you have to do it on your opponent's turn, and you have to have a counter rune face down, your Fungi in play as well. Your Fungi has to get attacked, so you use Follow the Wisp from something else to get Bronto Wisp out. Maybe just use the Wisp card anyway, randomly on your turn after your opponent goes to get it out. I think it's a little clunky to get out, but when it's out, it's going to be pretty menacing because it can just pop Fungi to destroy runes, and if your Fungi that you just got attacked with and you responded with Follow the Wisp, it gets destroyed still, so you get Bronto Wisp out. You can get it right back out by expending fire to get Fungi back, so you have Fungi ready to go for your next turn. So it does make it a really clunky threat for your opponent to deal with in the moment, but once you pass your turn back to your opponent, they could just throw an Earthquake out and do some other shenanigans. You're playing Follow the Wisp, so your back row is probably a little bit weaker at responding to attacks if you're trying to attack lock your opponent. So maybe Control Fire is a thing, but we'll have to see. If Control Fire is a deck, the Bronto Whis is going to be the all-star of the deck, but I don't know how much, with the resource intensive that it needs, will it be powerful enough. Next up, Rummacoal, a 2/2 for 1 fire. When you normal cast this Rummacoal, you can search deck for a Stadium or Stoke the Forge. Add to your hand, this Rummacoal gets 1 attack for every fire enchanting it as long as Volcanic Forge is enchanted. So it effectively doubles the effectiveness of Volcanic Forge on itself, as well as either searches for Forge or searches for Stoke the Forge. I think this card's actually like sleeper powerful. The ability to find either your Stadium Rune, or if you already have the Stadium Rune, any 1-drop Elestral at invoke speed is really powerful. Is this going to see a ton of play? I don't know, but definitely I would say in any fire deck you run this as, instead of like, you run this over Jolton in your fire decks because it has a lot more versatility than say a Jolton. It does have less attack stat, but the ability to either search a Stadium or effectively pay 1 more to search any other 1-drop fire Elestral makes this very much like a Rummagem in fire with added steps, but for the payoff of having more stats. So it's going to be really powerful in any kind of Earth Nexus deck, or just maybe even Earth Stadium or Earth Beatdown. Maybe with this plus Valkyries and stuff makes a viable deck now because you can search out all these fire beaters and stuff. I think the card's going to be really powerful just as a consistency tool in any fire deck, as well as Rummagem. Next up, we got Scavicoal. It's a 5/4 for 2 fire, and it does basically the same thing that Scavagem does, which is you search your deck for 2 fire cards instead of 2 earth cards that cost 1 or 2 and add them to your hand. What are you doing with this card? If you play this card, you are generally just going for Eruption. I don't see anything. This is an Ascension that lets you burn your opponent for possibly 6 in your turn for the added cost of Ascending and 1 fire and then casting the 2 Eruptions. So this card's looking pretty nuts just because you can double Eruption your opponent off an Ascension. Maybe we see this played with like in Fearix and stuff, so you kind of always can ascend into it and then throw Eruptions at your opponent's face. Other things you do with this card that are not as degenerate as just double Eruptioning is finding the Glavoliths and your Tutor cards and Volcanic Forge and Stoke the Forge and all that jazz. But this card also can just get like Gorgons or whatnot, and then it's useless for the rest of the game. But it is pretty degenerate where you just kind of go, I'll get 2 Eruptions now. So you do have to watch out for those fire decks and those burn decks with this card, especially if they're sending into it. So be aware. I think this card's pretty powerful, but at least it's only an Ascension, so you do have to sacrifice the Nostril in a sense to play it. But yeah, it's 2 eruptions for 7, which is fine at rate, unless you're going up against another fire deck. I think this card's going to be, I don't know if it's going to be powerful, but it's definitely going to be not a fun card to see, because once your opponent plays it, you know you probably just lost the game. We have a Humus reprint, which is nice because we do see some extra mill cards. I don't want to talk too much on Humus as it is a reprint, but it's nice to have it in a main set as a common, as well as we're going to see some fire control cards in the set, so it might make Humus a little bit more viable to play with like the fungi stuff, to try to attack lock your opponent and then mill them out over time. So we'll have to see if a fire control deck is viable enough now that Humus is a valid win condition in that deck, as opposed to just being this weird combo mill deck. You can kind of equate Humus to Barab, where Barab is burning, this is milling. So we see that, you know, that kind of effect can be good. It's just a matter of if there's enough in the decks to make it work. So Humus is nice to see, but we do have a new Humus Ascension, which is a 4/3 for 1 fire, 1 solar. You can disenchant its casting cost from this Humburst to force an opponent to send top 6 cards from their deck to the underworld. I don't know how powerful that is, but it's definitely nice to have this big finisher where if you're playing fire control mill and you played your Humbust already, you milled a bunch of cards, and then you get it to the next turn, you mill another bunch of cards, and you go ascend over Humbust to Humburst, disenchant, pop for 6. That's going to be a nice like finishing piece for the mill deck, as well as since mill's running Rise from the Ashes, there's a world where you go like ascend over Humbust to Humburst, mill for 6, send Humburst to Underworld, bring it back with Rise from the Ashes, and do it again for another 6. So if you do that, basically where you go like Humbust turn, defend it, mill for 8, Humbust again, mill for 8, so that's 16 cards, ascend into Humburst, throw Humburst for 6, so that's what, 22, 28 cards, so your opponent might have 7 cards left if you do that on turn 2. This card's going to be pretty dirty as a finisher, but I don't know if it's playable because you need to make sure you have the other control stuff going for it. But if you're playing mill, it might be a solid 1 or 2 of in fire mill, fire solar mill. But mill I don't think is super viable even with all the extra support in the set. Next up we have Ash Rabbit, a 2/5 for 1 fire. When this Ash Rabbit receives 1 over fire, you can target 3 cards in your underworld. Then an opponent chooses one of them to return that card to your hand or spirit deck. So this is definitely obviously an Ash Rabbit type effect in fire, and it's definitely going to be good for those control fire decks, especially if you can repeatedly use it, so you give your opponent less and less options to return stuff every turn. However, this is really bad turn 1 because you have to target 3 cards. So generally what happens is, let's say you play Nog turn 1, so you have 2 fire and a Nog in your underworld, you play Ash Rabbit behind it, you get 1 fire back. That's decent. It's a wall. It definitely gets better and better the later the game goes on, because then you can go, oh, I want Gorgon's PTA or Shield back, and your opponent has to give you those counter runes. If you can repeat it constantly, you can just kind of use it as recovery in fire. I think the card's really powerful, and I think it's going to add to that fire control shell that we're seeing in the set. I don't know how powerful it will be. I definitely don't think it's Ash Rabbit level, but it definitely has, I think, more abuse potential than Ash Rabbit, where instead of finding cards from the top of your deck, you're choosing one of 3 cards from your underworld to get back, and you're giving your opponent the choice, which is the negative, but your opponent will generally be reduced choices when you say, hey, I choose 2 Earthquakes and a Royal, or yada yada yada. So if you have a lot of redundant cards, this makes this card basically just, I get back what I need from my underworld, and your opponent's going to have to suffer with that. Or if you play it maybe in a fruit deck as for fruit recovery, so you go, hey, I want one of my Ambrosias back. There's a lot of stuff you can do with this card that I think makes it really strong and abusable, but it does need to be done later in the game to make it powerful. So that's a little bit more balanced than Ash Rabbit, where Ash Rabbit you just go turn 1, just combo off with it. This you have to wait a turn or 2 to really start getting value out of it, because you're just generally probably going to get spirits back if you play it early. Alright, and 2 more cards left to go. We're going to do Don't Poke the Bear. It's a 1 fire counter rune. It can only be cast during the battle phase. Target an Celestial and give it 4/4 until the end of turn. This is pretty good, actually. Like, bear decks obviously aren't the strongest, but this makes bears pretty threatening, because you can all of a sudden just protect a bear or win a battle with a bear. If you have an Earthseer in attack position, your opponent goes, oh, I'll just attack over it with my Elechick, and you go, don't poke the bear, and Earthseer now destroys your Elechick, specialing out another bear. It's going to be pretty good. Generally, this allows more consistency in getting lots of little guys out, because you can protect them from attack threats and use other runes to protect them from spell threats. So I think this card's going to be really powerful. I don't think it makes bears a tier deck, but it definitely makes bears from like maybe a meme tier deck to like actually casually viable to maybe tier 3, tier 2.5-ish. Like this is a really powerful card in that deck because it just asks your opponent to have a lot of ways to get over small threats, whereas Zeus probably won't be enough, and if they have to preemptively Zeus your bears and you don't have this card, that's a pretty good bluff. So I think this card's really powerful, and it's an Ursa rune, so you can search for it with your Ursicle, I think I got that right. So it's searchable and it's a combat trick. I think this card's really powerful. I think it's going to make bears actually playable in a weird way, but this is a really good card. I like it. And lastly for today, we have Follow the Wisp, which we spoke about with Funguide. It has Funguide's effect where you target Elestral on your field, and the Elestrals cannot be attacked this turn as long as that Elestral is enchanted. So if you target a big, let's say you target an Ash Rabbit, well now your opponent has to attack Ash Rabbit over your other cards this turn. And if you have a Funguide in play as well, you can now special cast your Bronto Wisp out. Again, control fire card. It's nice to see an effect like this where it's weaker than a Tsunami but has impact in specific decks to make it stronger. It's okay. Unless we have ways to really spam out Fire Elestrals, like maybe Ignectar is playable with this card now, where you can get lots of board presence and use Follow the Wisp to protect your other things. I don't see this being played in any really other deck other than a Wisp control fire deck with like Ash Rabbit, your Wisp, your Bronto Wisps, and then maybe using things like Scavicle to finish the game off, or your Humbus to finish the game off. But we'll have to see. I think control fire actually has some legs in this set, as well as kind of your standard fire stuff. Get some additional benefit with things like Scavicle in this set. So fire is interesting. It's nice to see fire get some tools when fire was basically not playable in base set, and we saw fire having either control heavy stuff in base set or aggro heavy stuff in base set, and it's nice to see both those sides of fire being really represented in both Frostfall and now Daybreak. So it's cool to see those things, and I appreciate the fire support. Alright, so that's the end of the video. We took a look at all the Lunar, the Earth, and the Fire cards in this video. I'll go over another 3 elements in the next video, and we'll save probably Solar for last, so we'll probably do Solar by itself because there's so many cards. But until then, I'll see you guys in the next video, and we'll go over probably Frost, Thunder, and Wind, and maybe Water. We'll have to see how long the video gets, but I'll see you guys in the next one, and peace. Have a good one.